Good evening, adoption community, and welcome to another episode of Adoption Happy Hour brought to you by the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, also known as NAAP, where it is our mission to bring unity to our community by elevating the diverse voices of the adoption constellation. I'm Marcie Keithley, your host for the evening, along with Jennifer Falsing in the Zoom room with fellow board members. David, show of hands. And I know Barbara will probably be joining us later. David, you want to take just a moment, please, if you would, and share about adoptee pathways to recovery.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marcie. I have a distinct honor of collaborating with the National Association of Adoptees and Parents to run a bi-weekly group called Adoptee Paths to Recovery. And ultimately, we honor adoptee routes to recovery, acknowledging that each person's path is unique and that it reflects their personal experiences and strengths. We host them. I facilitate them. I have a co-facilitator, Teresa Knorr, who joins me in the room. And we both have recovery experience. We both have adoption experience, and we're both exposed to substance use disorder treatment and adoption support professionally as well. And it's an opportunity to give and receive that social support that so many of us need in recovery, but also to align ourselves with people with similar goals as our own. So we'd love to have you, or we'd love for you to pass along the word that we meet every other Tuesday. Our next meeting is Tuesday, September 7th at 8:30 Eastern Time, 5:30 Pacific. Please join us. If you're not sure if it's a place for you or someone you might have in mind, please email me, david@naapunited.org. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And I would like to go ahead and mention as well, as David is not only a board member and runs his support group for us bi-monthly, he will be keynoting at our upcoming conference on September 10th. He opens up on Friday morning. So we're anxious to see David and hear what his wonderful keynote. So, okay. A few little I'm having trouble talking tonight. A few housekeeping items this evening, Jennifer. Okay, a little bit more about us. Everything right now is all about conference. That's coming up again this September 9th, 10th, and 11th in the Embassy Suites in Indianapolis. This is a hybrid conference, so we do have attendees that will be there in person as well as watching from home. So whether if you can't make it to Indianapolis, we totally understand. We still have virtual tickets available. So you're welcome to, I'm sure Jennifer will be sharing that in the chat bar, how you can purchase a ticket if you'd still like to come. And we'd love to see you there. Okay, so at this time it gives me, it's my honor to introduce our spotlight guest for this evening, Torie DiMartile. She is a 28-year-old biracial Black transracial adoptee from Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. She grew up predominantly in a white community where she struggled to find her place and cultivate a positive racial identity. She is a PhD student at Indiana University and also runs the IG account Wreckage and Wonder, where she microblogs. She is passionate about equipping hopeful adoptive parents with the tools they need to raise healthy transracial adoptees and advocating for more ethical, anti-racist adoption reform. So let's everyone welcome Torie to our happy hour. Welcome, Torie. We're so glad to have you tonight.
Thank you so much, Marcie. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see your faces, even if it's just in a little square. I want to start first with just a few acknowledgements. First to Marcie and to everyone at NAAP for just the effort and the vision for this happy hour. I think it's wonderful that we're continuing to have multiple spaces for everyone that is impacted by adoption to gather, to dialogue, and to share more about our stories. So thank you for the invitation. I also want to recognize the indigenous tribes, the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware people on whose ancestral lands I reside here in Bloomington, Indiana, which is where I currently live for my graduate school studies. I think it's really important that we recognize the very complex history of adoption in the United States, and specifically the displacement, removal, intergenerational trauma and violence that First Nations people have experienced at the hands of largely government-initiated child welfare programs and policies. So I want to acknowledge and honor these tribes who are past, present, and future caretakers of our land. And I encourage you to take some time, maybe after this workshop or even later on this weekend, to use a link that Jennifer has. She'll drop it in the chat for you all, where you can learn more about the Native tribes on whose land you currently reside. And you can also learn more about the informal and formal adoption history of Native peoples at large. So I've included a few book recommendations that might be of interest as well. I'm going to speak mostly tonight, and then at the end I'll show a few photos, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions, because for me personally, that's my favorite part. So tonight I really just kind of want to share about my story and my approach to adoption work and activism. So I'll start by explaining a little bit about my personal background. So I was placed through infant domestic open adoption in 1993 as a biracial Black child into a white home. And when my parents adopted my sister and I, she is also biracial, but is not biologically related to me, they did so during a really unique time in adoption history. Transracial adoption was very rare, as was open adoption. They ended up, however, getting really thorough open adoption education, which is always kind of a surprise to me during this time period. So I enjoyed an open relationship with my birth mother throughout my childhood and my adulthood, largely because of the open-minded education that they received from their adoption agency. However, they received no education when it came to race, racism, child racial identity development, or Black hair and skin care. So growing up in the suburbs of Northern Kentucky, it became increasingly obvious that cultivating a life where diverse families were part of our everyday experience was pretty impossible. While our church, school, and local playgrounds didn't serve as spaces that reinforced my and my sister's racial identity, my parents really strove to make our household a place that validated and celebrated our heritage. And people are always eager to hear, what did your parents do right? What did they do well? And I always cite that as something that I'm proud of. Our house was full of lots of material culture, storybooks, African folk tales, figurines, paintings. To this day, my mom laughs that she made it a point for any art in our home to represent people of color. So no art was allowed to be just of white people. If white people were included, it needed to be with other diverse individuals. And she always thinks it's funny because when I was 16 and allowed to redo my room, I chose as the focal point a white actress. So she always finds that ironic that she strove really hard to make sure that our whole house was full of lots of Black and brown people, but that I chose early on to have a white actress as the focal point in my bedroom. And I think that honestly, even though it's a funny story, it speaks volumes about the way I perceived myself within the larger white community outside of my home. So while inside of my home, I felt very loved and validated, and my skin color was spoken of frequently and with affection, once I left my home, it was a totally different world. White community, everywhere we went, school teachers, pastors, church congregation, parks, mentors, I struggled to understand where my brown self fit into a largely white world. Classmates in second grade often told me that I didn't have a quote unquote real sister because we didn't share biological ties. I remember asking my mom as a child why the church mural that showed Jesus welcoming all the little children had no brown or Black children sitting in Jesus's lap. A lot of white peers denied that I was biracial, and a lot of Black individuals challenged my parents on the fact that they chose to adopt brown children. When I went on to college, I struggled even more because I grew up in a white community and I didn't have any access to or engagement with Black community. So many Black peers in college claimed I wasn't Black enough because I was socialized in a white community. And peers would often question my ability to love my adoptive parents because I wasn't biologically their own. So really, no matter where I turned, I felt like the world's message to me was, you don't belong. And despite the underlying emotions of self-doubt and rejection and illegitimacy that I felt around being an adoptee and being a person of color, my behavior in middle school and high school would have never suggested I had an internal struggle. I was the smell the roses, do every extracurricular activity, good grades, larger than life kid. I was always happy. And I also made a point to always do the right things. I came home before curfew. I obeyed my parents. I was a good child. And I was applauded for being a good child. I was given lots of affirmation. And I made being the good child my identity. And what I know now is that I was afraid to rock the boat. And despite the unconditional love that I did feel from my parents, I was afraid to give them a reason to wish they hadn't adopted me. I was afraid if I wasn't the good child, I would be the unwanted child. So I believe many adoptees struggle with this kind of urge to people please and impress in order to receive acceptance and provide themselves with a shield, really, against rejection. And this is a struggle that I continue to have as an adult. And that's one thing that I strive to talk about in my blog and in my activist work, because I really want to normalize that adoption is a lifelong experience and adults still struggle with it. It's not simply something that needs to be at the forefront of childhood and adolescence. So it wasn't until after undergrad that race, adoption, and identity truly came into focus for me. It wasn't until I had a really jarring, kind of profound loss that the floodgates opened and all of these dormant emotions that were attached to my identity, my trauma, my race suddenly burst to the surface. And I went through a pretty awful breakup after 5 years of dating, and the rejection and abandonment that I felt from that breakup kind of served as an echo of that original primal wound. And it also served as the catalyst for my coming out of the fog. So I went to my first adoption conference after that. I met and spoke with the first transracial adoptees that were not related to me. I began therapy. I started to question the tightly knit and simplistic narratives of adoption that I had absorbed. And I also began using my own critical thinking skills to understand adoption within a larger context, specifically through the lens of the anthropology degree that I was and am still pursuing. So I no longer was seeing it solely as my individual story of Torie and her happy family that found each other through adoption. I started to see that adoption entails much larger social issues of class, of racial inequality, of lack of resources for vulnerable communities, corruption in terms of reproductive rights. And that was hard for me to grapple with, because for most of my life, I had seen adoption as a very personal, individual experience that was divorced from kind of the larger happenings of the world. And when I began to kind of share publicly about what I was learning and experiencing through the blog and Instagram account that I now run called Wreckage and Wonder, I began to find a space where I could just simply speak. I was no longer alone. I was no longer invisible in this adoptee and biracial Black identity. And I originally used this blog as a space to say I'm here and I matter. And then it blossomed into so much more. It became relationships with other transracial adoptees, invitations to speak on podcasts and panels. And before long, it has become its current iteration, which is a space where I provide education for hopeful white adoptive parents on topics like anti-racism, racial identity development, and healthy transracial parenting. So as a freelance consultant, I work with potential transracial adoptive parents, and my approach to guiding them is steeped in my personal experiences, my graduate studies in anthropology, and a historically informed understanding of adoption. And it's my conviction that proactive and thorough education before parents adopt can really lay a strong foundation for healthy transracial families. And then that education is not solely prior to adoption, but that it's an ongoing investment. And of the dozens of families I've consulted, inevitably, the one question I receive over and over and over and over again is, what do I need to know to do this right? What do I need to know to not mess this up? Right? I'm thinking about bringing a Black or brown child into my house and loving them and adopting them as my own. What do I need to know to do this right? And parents speak with me on Instagram in personal messages, stop me after conferences, and they're desperate. They want to know, give me a list. Give me a list of the do's and don'ts of raising a child of color. They want recommendations on racially diverse toys or ways to meaningfully celebrate cultural holidays. And they honestly come out of a deep desire to parent well. They just want to do right by a child that they are going to welcome into their home and love. But I often find that there's a preoccupation with what needs to be added in order to do justice to raising a child of color, and not necessarily what needs to be removed. So while asking about what do I need to bring, what kind of workshops should I sign up for, what kind of books should I buy, while those are important questions, a lot of my consulting revolves around encouraging families to ask a different question. Rather than what do I need more of to transracially adopt, ask yourself, what do you need less of? What do you need to remove? What do I need to remove in terms of biases, in terms of unconscious racist beliefs, or deeply held privileges in order to raise a healthy child of color? What beliefs do I have right now that I might need to re-examine? What barriers do I need to remove to be possibly less defensive, more open to change, criticism, and improvement? So I often think of it as many hopeful adoptive parents want to run before they crawl, right? But the thing is, I try to encourage them to recognize that they can't begin to parent a Black, Hispanic, Asian child until they've spent quality time reflecting on their own attitudes about race and ethnicity and culture, before they've spent quality time uprooting anything that might be toxic, anything that might prevent them from connecting meaningfully with their child. So I'm always mentioning the fact that they can add as many books and podcasts and multicultural toys as they want, but they could still possibly be holding negative, destructive, harmful beliefs and values about people of color. That it's very possible to still have prejudiced, unconscious racist views and adopt a Black or brown child. So one of my main priorities during my sessions is to stress the importance of a mindset shift, of an internal conviction, of an assessment of values. Because when parents do the really hard, don't get me wrong, this is not easy work, and we all need to do it to some degree, right? We all carry with us preconceived notions. We all carry with us inaccurate views of other people. We all carry with us our specific world view that at some point in life might need to be altered, might need to be cracked open, right? So this is not easy work. But when they do that work of dismantling their own biases and they commit to doing so with humility, they're in the best position to parent their transracial adoptee. That question that they're asking, what are all the do's and don'ts? All the do's and don'ts flow from an internal state of mind of valuing Black and brown people at large. That if they haven't already done the work to begin protecting and elevating and learning from and valuing Black and brown people, and all Black and brown people, not just the ones they plan to adopt, then later on down the road, it may be difficult for their child to trust them as able to hold and validate their racialized experiences. So I speak at length with them about how adopting a Black or brown child also means adopting their larger racial and cultural community. And that ultimately, as parents, their actions and behavior should value the fact that they are welcoming their child's entire community and not just their child. The other important aspect of my time with parents is discussing the difference between preventative parenting and proactive parenting. So many parents ask, how can I prevent my child from feeling X? Put whatever you want in the place of X. How do I prevent my child from feeling rejection? How do I prevent my child from feeling stuck between a white and Black community? How do I prevent my child from feeling grief? And you can't, right? If you don't want your child to have any of those feelings, then you're preventing your child from truly living, right? So I try to bring them into this understanding that you can make frequent, clear, and open conversations about identity, race, and grief commonplace in your home. You can equip your children with the resources, the community, and vocabulary that they're going to need to navigate the complexities of transracial adoption. You can't prevent it, but you can proactively equip them with what's necessary to engage with those difficult, messy emotions in a healthy and effective way. So those are just a few of the approaches that I take in my consulting, which are based out of my own personal adoption story and experiences. And that's a little bit about me and the investment that I have in ensuring the next generation of transracial adoptees have the right support to live their fullest, most authentic lives, despite the complexity of adoption and race. So that's really kind of all I had prepared to share with you explicitly. And I'm hoping that any questions you might have can come a little bit from what I was able to share with you in that brief time. I will share, before we kind of open the floor for questions, we'll share here just a few photos here. So this is my mom and my dad, in the early 90s, which I'm sure you can tell by the fabric of the couch and my mom's dress and her hair. That's my sister in the middle, who is also biracial. She is lighter than me and has had a very different experience with race, identity, and adoption than I have. So if anybody has questions about two siblings living under the same family and how they experience adoption and race differently, maybe I can speak to that. They were both around, my mom was 45 and my dad was 40 when they decided to adopt. So my parents are significantly older than the majority of my peer group. And their own education around race and adoption came much later in life. I would say about 3 years ago. They really began to ask deeper, more nuanced questions about adoption and racial identity. This is a picture of my mom and I. It's one of my favorite pictures of us. And just a quote that I pulled from a blog that we wrote together, which I think expresses some of the naivete my parents had at the start of their adoption journey. It says, quote, "We were in our own little world of love. The realization that they would both need more than love came after the decision to adopt. What I didn't know then, but know now, is that we didn't begin to scratch the surface of their need. For my husband and me, the experience of raising children was great, but in hindsight, we weren't prepared. Though ignorance was bliss for us, and maybe even for our kids then, it's not bliss now for us and for our children today as adults." So that's just a little introspection on my mom's part, which I always like to share because I really value that she has taken the time and the effort to do that kind of work for herself and for my family. And then last but not least, this is my birth mom on the right. And then my birth grandmother on the left. So Karen is my birth mother in the blue, and Judy Grams is what I call her, as my maternal grandmother on the left. So yeah, that is at my undergraduate college graduation, which was really special to have them both present for. My birth mom, when she got pregnant with me, she had to quit her job and she dropped out of college and ended up not returning. So she made into an adoptive placement. So it was a pretty special moment to share my college graduation with her. All right, that's all I have to share. I would absolutely love to spend the rest of the time hearing from you all and answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Torie, for presenting. This is some great pictures.
Thank
So,
you.
may I ask, when did do you want to tell us a little bit about your reunion and how that went, or how you found one another?
Yeah, so maybe it wasn't as clear earlier, but my birth mom and I have had an open relationship since I was born. So she was present for my early birthdays. My parents were really proactive in incorporating her in family traditions. So she and Judy Grams would come to carve pumpkins, paint Easter eggs, hang decorations on the tree. Of course, as I got older and went to college and moved, connecting with both of them has become more difficult, but I've always had an open relationship with them. My birth father, on the other hand, was not involved in the overall process of placing me as a child. He was supportive of that choice, but didn't necessarily do the physical and emotional labor of finding a family and going through the logistics of making an adoption plan. He and my birth mother did not get married. And for a long, long time, I was really unsure of the specifics of my racial identity. My birth mother knew that my birth father was Black. He's extremely dark, has beautiful ebony skin, but was under the impression that he might also be something else. Wasn't sure if he was just African American or if he was African, if he had any ethnic roots from other areas of the world. So early on, my parents relied a lot on other people to help them help me understand my racial identity. So we had one restaurant in all of town that was owned by an Indian family, and that was Dunkin' Donuts. And we went every Saturday, and I always got a free donut because they thought I was Indian. And my parents explained that I was adopted, and they weren't 100% sure of my racial identity. And they said, oh, she's from India. Definitely from India. We can promise you. Here's pictures of our daughter. She looks just like her. So for the early years, my parents told me I was Indian, from India. And I wanted to know more. So when I turned 11, I told them I want to meet my birth father and ask him questions about my racial identity and hear about our history. So my birth mom at that time reached out to him and facilitated that introduction. And he said, oh, you're not Indian from India at all. You're Seminole Native American Indian and Black African American from Alabama. And I thought, oh, that's very different. So we had an open relationship for about 11 years. He was remarried and has 4 children. They don't know that I'm their biological sibling. I'm referred to as their friend, Torie. And when I was 22, I pressed, after a long time, my birth father and asked him if I could meet his mother. And he had for a long time really evaded the question. And he finally revealed that it was because he hadn't told his family. So his entire family, my whole Black side of my family at 22 years old, didn't know that I existed. And he hadn't yet told his mom that when he was young, he and a woman he met had a child, and they placed that child for adoption. So after he told her, he gave me her email address, and we've been email corresponding and talking over the phone for about 4 or 5 years. But neither of us have necessarily had the courage to meet up in person yet. So that's kind of where I'm at in reunion at large. I don't know if there's any other specific questions about that, but that's a little bit to get us started.
Great. We do have some questions coming in, Torie. Let's see. Peter from Australia is asking about, do these prospective adoptive parents ever divulge why the need to change a child's identity, change in their birth certificate, adopt rather than seek guardianship? Could you speak a little bit to that?
That's a great question. None of them, I don't believe that a majority of the parents I speak with have a critical enough awareness of the surrounding traumas of adoption to consider those questions. They are deeply invested in having a child to call quote unquote their own. A number of them have dealt with infertility issues, and a number of them are still grieving that infertility. Most of them are younger couples. Some of them are older, like my parents were. But those are things that I might bring up in our conversation with them. And sometimes it's hard for them to understand the need for an original birth certificate, or even the need to preserve a child's cultural identity, because some of them feel as though, well, this child will be in our family, so therefore they will have our cultural identity. They will have our family history. I would say generally most of them are open to those complexities, but it takes some significant prodding and exhaustive prodding. And sometimes it's uncomfortable to bring up questions such as that, are you prepared to move neighborhoods for the sake of your child's cultural or racial identity? Are you prepared to advocate for your child with friends, family, and coworkers? Oh, well, we hadn't really thought about what our family might think about transracial adoption. Well, you probably should consider that. A lot of times I get questions about names, and many of them are concerned about preserving family names that they have in their lineage. And I have to remind them that that's equally important for an adopted child, that they will also want names that are from their birth family. So sometimes we converse a lot about how to kind of have a happy balance, acknowledging that they desire to name a child, but also acknowledging that that's ultimately the right of the birth family, and it's the right of a child to their original name.
Thank you, Torie. David is asking, you wrote on your website, I contain multitudes and my identity is nuanced. Very powerful. Could you describe this as though you're speaking to someone unfamiliar and unaware of adoptee issues?
That's a very good question. So one thing, I sometimes talk to parents about this, right? Think about yourself. Think about David, and I don't know you, David, so I apologize if any of this is inaccurate. But David is not simply David who shows up to work as part of NAAP. David is also possibly a father. David is also possibly a husband. David is also someone with a specific racial or ethnic identity. David is also someone with a specific, lineage in terms of where his family grew up regionally in the US, right? All of those things are part of someone's identity. I think a lot of people forget that literally everybody has identity, and everybody's identity is multifaceted. Everybody's identity is nuanced. Everybody's identity entails pieces that overlap on each other. And sometimes those pieces collide against each other, right? And so that's some of the work I try to do with parents, to explain, it's not just your adoptee that has a complex identity. We're talking about adoption and race, etc., because those are added layers. But they already have many layers that you also share, right? So every single person is going to have an identity that has multiple prongs, right? That intersect with various parts of who they are and how they present themselves and who they are to other people. And I try to explain that for adoptees, it's particularly difficult because they are different things to different people, right? To a birth parent, they are their biological child. To an adoptive parent, they're an adoptive child that most adoptive parents feel as though is their own and that they don't want to share. So how then does that adoptee negotiate and navigate those two very separate expectations of who they are in life? How then does that adoptee understand themselves to be attached to a family that isn't present, but also attached to a family that didn't physically create them? That's a little jarring, right? Those are two separate identities, but then those identities somehow come into contact with each other. And those different identities coming into contact with each other can sometimes create friction. And that friction is what adoptees have to navigate. Then add on top of it an adoptee that's Black or Asian. Their family sees them as just another child in the family, and they might possibly see them as white, but just with dark skin. And then the rest of the world sees them as Asian or sees them as Black. So then how does that child negotiate an identity within a family where they're just like everyone else, and an identity in the world where they're very, very different? So that's kind of the dialogue I try to have with folks who don't really understand, like, what do you mean it's so complicated to be an adoptee that's brown? Well, it's complicated to be a human. So think of all the human complications and the various identities that you have to inhabit every day. And for you, it happens pretty seamlessly. You go to work, you're a work person, you go home, you're a dad, you're a wife, you're a sibling, you're a father, you're, right? But then add on top of those existing identities something that is even more complicated. So that's kind of how I try to talk about it.
Okay, Peter has made an additional comment. Identity is so important. It is the reason you get up in the morning. It is your self-esteem. It is the reason you function or not.
Yes.
And Torie, you know, what you were just saying just a few moments ago about those two worlds, okay, that you have with the adoptive family, their perception, and your bio family. In your opinion, how could those two worlds, how could you fuse that? If you're speaking to an adoptive family, what would you recommend to them, how they can fuse those two worlds?
I think the first thing I would say is let go of like some desire to be normal. Like, let go of this expectation that we need to mimic quote unquote normal families, but that adoptive families are just inherently gonna be more complex. And getting a child comfortable with that complexity and able to navigate that complexity smoothly, you really have to start from the very beginning. It's not acceptable to try to insert conversation about how these two families somehow coexist when they're 5 years old or 10 years old. It has to begin, I believe, pre-verbally. And that's what my parents did. Hi, we're your parents. You were born from Karen, who's your mother. You were then placed with us. We are also your mother and father. You have two families who love you very much. They said that to me before I even could understand them. And I think that's really good because that meant that they had to practice. It's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of adoptive parents to have that kind of conversation with their child because they're afraid they're going to mess up. But if you're looking at a baby and you're practicing with a baby doesn't totally get you. So if you mess up at that point, you have some flexibility. So I think it's really smart to practice what kind of dialogue and vocabulary are you going to be using? How are you going to answer specific questions? What do you find age appropriate? So practicing that early and often. And then I also really believe that it's important that parents don't kind of make things into a fantasy or kind of use unrealistic scenarios, things like storks coming and dropping you off, or, you know, God in heaven mixed up the babies and you became ours. Those are all kind of like folk tale veiled stories that make parents sometimes feel more comfortable because they don't actually have to tell the truth. And so I really always tell parents, like, let's not create these weird stories and beat around the bush. Your children need to know that you're going to speak to them clearly and factually, and that you're going to tell them the truth. So I think those are the two things that serve as a foundation for fusing families together. And then the other thing is viewing birth family as family and understanding that though they may occupy a different position in life, they deserve just as much value. They have just as much integrity. And, sorry, that's my dog. Because sometimes I do think adoptive parents view birth family as competition rather than as additional resources, additional villagers in the community of raising their child. So that's kind of how I would frame it.
Okay, Barbara, you made a comment earlier, and I wanted you to elaborate on that if you could, please. Barbara Robertson. Did I catch you off guard? Okay, I'll keep going here. Let's see. Tammy Murphy asked, has anyone ever made a negative comment about you being raised outside of your race?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I remember in college, I had a Black friend, more of an acquaintance, and she said, you don't know what it really means to be Black. Your parents probably raised you to hate Black people. And I still to this day feel gutted by that comment for a couple reasons, because I know that my parents worked hard. They failed in a lot of things. They had opportunities they didn't take, but I know that they tried really hard. And then secondly, adoptees, I think, deal with the fear of illegitimacy and inadequacy at large. And I think that Black and brown adoptees that are placed into white families feel racially illegitimate a lot, feel like they don't have any claim to their own racial identity because it was all but ignored, erased, or whitewashed growing up. So, you know, there was a part of me that felt like, okay, that's a fair question or fair comment, or, you know, that's a valid emotion that you have about my adoption. But it is something that I have had to navigate as a younger adult, as an older adult, more so, less with like Black peers and more with white strangers saying things like, oh, you're just so lucky. You know, think of what kind of life you would have had if your parents hadn't raised you. A lot of people growing up assumed that I wasn't American. They assumed that I was Ethiopian or Indian or Pakistani. So there was a lot of kind of Western saviorism commentary, like, oh, aren't you so glad that you're not, you know, back in the country where you could have been? And I still get kind of comments like that, less about like my parents adopting me and more about, you know, if you're critical of adoption, then go back to wherever you came from, that kind of stuff. So critical of my racial identity in correspondence with my parents being white. I've received all of it, I feel like, from both sides. Yeah.
Okay, Torie, Bruce would like to know, he says, so often open adoptions don't remain open. How was your open adoption arranged, and what allowed you to be so successful, stable, and mutually nourishing for so long?
I think I had a really mature parent. My mom was really selfless. I know it hurt her. It was really hard for her to make space for my birth mom. You know, this is her, you know, her child, and she wants to raise the child, and she wants to feel all the first emotions, and it was hard to share. But she really put those emotions second and strove to elevate my birth mom and her position in my life. And my birth mom was also very mature as well. I think they were both emotionally mature and humble. And I think that's what did it for me. I will also say that it's still hard. I think a lot of people think open adoption is the answer. Like, oh, if you have an open adoption, it's going to be easy. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, the problem with open adoption, where you only see each other 3 times a year, is you don't see growth in your child. So for a long time, my birth mom didn't always know what my likes or interests were because I was changing so fast. She would tickle me to have me laugh in a photo, and I'd be like, I'm 15. I don't feel that way anymore. Or put stickers on things when I wasn't into stickers anymore. And that's not her fault or my fault. It's the default of, you're not living together. You're not growing together. You're not in constant relationship. And that causes some ambiguity where you're like, how do I relate to this person? Because you're my mother, but you're not my mother, right? So you birthed me, but you didn't raise me. So there's still, for me as an adoptee, some difficulty in understanding as an adult how I relate to my birth family. So I do want to emphasize the fact that it's not, a solution, and that there is guilt. I feel guilty a lot about, I love my birth mom, but I don't perceive her as my mother. And that makes me sad because she is my mother. So that's an emotion that I deal with. And I'm in the process of learning more about her experience in pregnancy and placement. And that's hard for me to listen to, because as an adoptee, you feel like, gosh, did I ruin their life? Did I mess everything up? Did I turn the tables on everything? And obviously, no, right? But that's sometimes how the irrational adoptee brain works. So just because it's open doesn't mean it's perfect, but it was made substantially better by really communicative, really mature adults.
Great, thank you. Savannah says, what is your opinion on transracial adoption? Should that be the last option? Would have you rather been adopted by brown people? How can we know we are adopting for the right reasons?
Oh, I'll be very honest, I don't like that question because I get it a lot, but I know it's a question a lot of people have. But I feel like it's an unfair question to ask adoptees. Like, do you wish that a Black family had adopted you? Well, that would entail me giving up everything I know. That would entail me erasing my childhood, my memories, my connection to my adoptive family. How would I ever do that? But at the same time, have I ever thought about it? Yeah, I've thought about it. Do you know how much easier my life would have been if my Black biological family knew I existed? Because Black families are extremely welcoming, and there's a lot of kinship care that happens in Black families. Aunts raise kids, uncles raise kids, grandparents raise kids. It's not uncommon. So is it possible that I would have been raised within that family? Maybe. Would I not have such imposter syndrome about being Black? Probably. But it still makes me choose. And I think that's fundamentally something that adoptees struggle with, is feeling like they need to choose between two families. And that's generally why I find that question difficult to answer and frustrating to answer, because at least in my experience, when it's been asked, it's asked with the intent of having a definitive answer. And I think so much of the adoptee experience is not about definitive answers. It's about navigating complexity and ambiguity. And I mean, I've had to talk to my adoptive mother about this, because she has asked, do you wish we hadn't adopted you? And my answer to her is, Mom, who is that question for? Is that question for me, or is it for you? Do you want me to say, of course not, Mom. I'm so happy with being adopted. I love you guys. I would have never wanted anything different. And at the end of the day, she says, yeah. I asked you that question because I want you to validate the fact that we adopted you. And my answer back to her is, well, that question serves you. It doesn't serve me, because if it's for me, you're asking me to decide, and that's not fair. So that's kind of how I feel. There was another aspect of that question, though, that was really good.
It says, how can we know we are adopting for the right reasons?
That's also a great question.
Yeah.
How do we know? How do you know you're adopting for the right reasons? I mean, I think it takes a lot of very honest, very uncomfortable introspection. And I also think it's really possible to wake up 30 years down the road and realize, even though you did all that work, that there was still underlying motives that were unhealthy or self-serving. My perspective is that transracial adoption should be a last case scenario. All adoption, I believe, should be a last case scenario. I believe in family preservation. I think that families that are struggling should be given the resources, help, and support and community to raise children within their biological unit. But that's not always possible. So I think that, you know, sometimes asking yourself questions about like what you feel you're entitled to, what you think you deserve as somebody that's adopting, and asking yourself, don't biological parents deserve that too? I don't know. That's a hard question. It's a good question. It's a hard question. How do you know if you're adopting for the right reasons? I have a really long list of questions that I ask every transracial, hopeful transracial adoptive parent to answer before they adopt. And it is a long and hard list of questions. And if you answer all those questions and you feel like no sweat, okay. Some people that I know have transracially adopted and they've done it really well. They've prepared and they're dedicated and they're ready to do ongoing work. That, I think, is the difference between doing it with the right intentions and doing it ethically and doing it poorly, is the willingness to adapt.
Thank you, Torie. Barb Robertson, let's circle back to you from earlier.
Yeah, was this the response? You were looking at my response to say that I was mad, right? Because, and just because hearing what Torie's saying right now, like, I feel that parents have, hopeful adoptive parents have a responsibility to, you know, to go through the hard things. And that is to question, why are they taking this path? And what are the implications of them bringing a child that does not look like anyone that they are around or have been around for maybe their entire life? They want to bring them into the family. Like, if they did not do the work to ask those questions and then to think that it doesn't matter, that's what really, I think, it triggers me the most, because it's, I thought I was isolated, you know, in terms of my adoptive parents, you know, back in the day didn't have to deal with things, but, you know, because they said, take the baby, you know, and raise them however you want, you know, tabula rasa, you know, blank slate. And no, we now know differently. We're not blank slates. And no, parents have to do the work, and they have to do whatever it takes to learn what it is. How can they parent the child that they have been given to raise? So, and all of those things. And if it makes them uncomfortable for them to take a journey to explore those things, even to the point where they need to be in uncomfortable spaces, then that, I feel, is the mark of a parent that is striving for maturity. You know, you mentioned that, Torie, like, striving for maturity to like, maybe they didn't understand at the beginning, but then now they're willing to take the journey. Like they're willing to adapt for the sake of the love of the child that they wanted to have. So yeah, that's part of the reason. I mean, smoke is coming out of my, you know, yeah, so please feel free to comment or, you know, any there, but that's why I made my statement.
Yes. Should give you a mic. No, I mean, I completely agree with that. And that is something that's the hardest part of the job of someone like me, is that you interrogate the intentions of hopeful adoptive parents. If you adopt a Black or brown child, and that Black or brown child is going to be the most meaningful relationship you've ever had with someone outside of your race, you are not prepared to adopt that child, right? I mean, we ask the same questions of preparedness and adaptation and, you know, willingness to advocate for children of other identities. Would you place a child that is in a wheelchair in a home that has 6 floors and no intention to install a lift or an elevator? You would not do that. That would be considered unethical. And my desire is that the same sentiment would be considered in transracial adoption, that it's no longer about options or added accessories, that it's your choice to take additional optional courses to learn how to adopt across race. It should be considered a matter of ethics, of endangering the well-being of a child. And I don't think it's considered that because racial well-being is not considered in the overall idea of well-being. It's physical well-being, spiritual well-being, emotional well-being. And racial includes all of those. So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Barbara. And I wish I could say that I see things moving forward swiftly, but I do see some change happening, and that keeps me mildly encouraged.
Okay. Oh, all right. Now I think I skipped someone up here. Let me back up just a little bit here. Oh, Sophia. She says, hey, I'm a Black transracial adoptee, and I struggled with connecting with aunts and uncles as long as I can remember. Do you ever feel that way?
Hi, Sophia. I don't know where you are on the screen, but it's nice that's nice to see you. It's nice that you're here. I haven't struggled with that because I've never met my Black family. I have, yeah. So I wish I could speak to that, but I can't. Oh, now hold on. Are you talking biological or adoptive? And I've struggled with connecting with my aunts and uncles as long as I can remember. So I'm not sure, maybe that can be clarified. I wasn't quite certain if that's connecting with biological or adoptive family.
Sophia, you can take yourself off mute if you would like.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant adoptive aunts and uncles and just relatives in general.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard for me because my relatives all live out of state. So by default, I felt disconnected to them because they all had a shared experience. Everybody did Easter together, shared inside jokes. We would always have to travel to see them twice a year. So I automatically felt a little of an outsider. But that was mostly because of the distance and not because of the adoption factor. I will say that like I struggle now, so like significantly connecting with my father, my adoptive father. He is not as dedicated to anti-racism and education and whatnot as my mom is. And that has created a serious rift in our relationship. And that is really hard to overcome for both of us. So yeah, I have felt that to a degree with some members of my family, and especially with my sister. Oddly enough, my parents like adopted 2 biracial kids so they could like commiserate over the experience together, and we never talked about adoption and we never talked about race. So it's not until recently, when we're both adults and she has her own biological family that she's created with her husband, that we're even beginning to connect over those experiences. And that's a long time to wait to connect over those things. So I would say yes, in that regard, with my parents and even with my adoptive sibling. It takes so much work. And that's one thing I just don't think people get about being adopted, and especially being transracially adopted, is it takes so much labor to be in relationship with your family. Like everybody else is dealing with school and work and everything else, and you're just trying to maintain and foster and solidify relationships with your most immediate people, because it's complex and messy and people get defensive and hurt, and you just really have to put in the labor. And it's largely unrecognized by everyone else in the world, because they're like, oh, they're family, you know, whatever, people don't get along. And it's like, no, you don't get it. There's so many layers here. So I would say don't feel alone. Like it takes a lot to connect and to maintain that connection, and it's not simple.
Okay, Tina, you're next, and then Peter, I would like you to comment after Tina, please, because I know we have a lot of information in the chat room. Tina Brown?
Sorry, I had to move myself. So thank you, Torie. Your presentation hits super close to home with me for multiple reasons. The age of your parents. I had a sister that was also adopted, that was blonde hair, blue eyed, and they had 3 biological children as well. So I was asking if you yourself, and this is super personal, so you just pass, if you yourself would consider ever adopting to grow your family, and why or why not?
That's a good question. And I think about it a lot. I've talked about it with my current partner. I waver. I would say right now I'm in the camp of I would not consider adoption. And it's mostly because I'm still knee deep in navigating my own adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that in the next 3 or 4 years, I'll be in an emotional, mental, spiritual place where I can hold space for someone else's adoption story besides my own. That currently my own adoption story, my adoptive parents, my adoptive sister, my birth family, not knowing my birth family, yada, 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 occupies so much of my emotional space and labor that I would feel as though I'm doing a disservice to a child that I adopt. I also feel at this point in time, if I adopted, it would be for the wrong reasons. I think I would adopt to fill the voids that I have in my own life. I would adopt to feel something. So I have, because I believe so strongly in family preservation, I have thought about fostering, because I love kids. I really do not want to biologically birth children, because that sounds torturous to me. I know other people do it and enjoy it, yada, yada, but I just don't want that. So I have thought about fostering, because I do want to see children returned to their families. But I'm also concerned that as somebody who deals with attachment issues and rejection, that might be a triggering experience. So I often am envious of others who, like, their reproductive decisions sound like, do we have enough space in the house, or do we live close enough to the grandparents? And I think for adoptees, the choice to give birth, adopt, or foster is so much more layered. So I'd be interested to hear from you if you're willing to share what your thoughts are on that.
So thank you so much. I feel like that's a super personal question, and you handled it with grace, and I just respect you that you're able to share so much thought about this. So many layers. I feel like you and I could probably talk about this for a little while, because my adoptive parents had 3 biological children. They also did foster care, emergency foster care, and we're talking about, this is many, many years ago. So it was different then, but in some ways they were ahead of their time in the way that they approached having their family. And yet the aspects of me as an individual and my ethnicity, I just blended in with them, right? So I knew my background, but anyway, so there was things done really well and then parts that were missed, just like you were saying. My adoptive mother at some point miscarried and I believe wasn't able to have more children after that. And they were already doing fostering and ultimately adopted my sister, who was an infant birth. The biological mother wanted to meet them before she would place her with my parents, which was unusual for that time. And then I was adopted 2.5 out of foster care. So very different. But growing up and having the conversations with people that clearly I shouldn't have been having these conversations with, asking me, oh, would you ever adopt? And I'm talking about as a single person, as a dating person, as a married person, as a person with children. So that's been this question that I feel like, I think as adoptees, do we get asked that a lot? I think especially as women, maybe.
Yes, I think
so.
On Tina.
Yes. Okay, so that's kind of where my question was coming from. I was curious to see your perspective, that I think the dialogue has changed and the way we can answer these questions is so much different now. And the options around your family staying together, I think also speaks volumes in that. So yes, I think there was a time when I actually was having conversations with people saying, oh, maybe, yes, I think I would. But I'm realizing now, looking back, that those were non-adopted people that were asking me, and I was almost feeling the burden of, is this my responsibility moving forward that I need to keep? I don't know how that gets passed on. So I think it was my own believing the narrative that I had been told that what adoption was.
Yeah.
And so I think at the time, if I would have said yes to that question, I don't even remember how I used to answer it. It would have been with that in mind, is that I need to help. I need to somehow.
Oh, your life was transformed by adoption. Don't you want to do that for someone else?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Okay. Peter, would you like to share just a little bit about some of the comments that you made about legislation that's going on over in Australia and share that with Torie?
Hi, Torie. Thanks very much for your story, and I relate very much to a lot of things, even though, well, I guess I am biracial because I'm half Italian, and and I wasn't aware of that before I made my own discovery. Yeah, look, there's lots of things happening here. There's pushing, backward and forwards about, family preservation against the forces of the infertility industry, and we have low rates of adoption here in Australia. That wasn't always the case. in the mid-70s, we had about the same rates as the USA. I just looked up the local adoptions in Australia. There's 48 in total a year. And I made a quote there that USA has approximately 13 times the population of Australia. So if you multiply 13 by 48, you come up with 624. I just did that to give some perspective. I don't think we have too many more, bad families, drug abuse, alcoholism, or any other thing. I don't think Americans are worse at looking after their kids than Australians. But the narrative of adoption and the size of your industry over there, I think really drives it. And and you've got a hard job in front of you of changing the narrative. We have a hard job changing the narrative here, but you have a even greater. And I'm always well aware of the situation in the States and the different legislations that you have, and the opposition to even opening birth records and adoption records, which we take for granted here. We have those, and we've had those for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, and in some cases longer than that. I just thought that might sort of give some people's perspective of the difference, and think again about as I think Tina said, is there a need to adopt? And look, I'm a foster carer as well, for long-term foster carer. I've never thought about adopting. Even I found out about my adoption 4 years ago, but I've cared for children long before that. Foster care is difficult. Not all kids fit in all families, and they moved on for various reasons, which is a shame. But I think I think foster care needs to be overhauled, and the narrative of foster care changed. The best experience I ever have is, and it's only happened to me once that I'm aware of, where we assisted and a child went back to the mother. And people say to me, "Oh, don't you get attached?" But it's how you approach it. My approach is that I want them to go back to their family if they can. That's the goal. It's not always achievable, and probably in most cases it's not, but it's the goal. And it doesn't mean I don't care for them. And look, we have one child here who can probably overhear me now because she's in the next room, but we've had her here for, she's not a child, she's not even an adult, she's over 10 years. And she's very much part of our family, but very much part of her own family. She's, maintained contact with her siblings and that, and, they come here as a, open door policy. They just arrive, and that's great. And they sometimes come, for Christmas and that sort of stuff. And, but I'm always aware that their family is most important to them, and I really encourage that wherever it's possible,
Yeah.
But
Thank you a lot for sharing all of that interesting information regarding Australia. I think we are very US centric in our understanding of adoption and in our discussions about adoption. So I'm always excited when we can kind of reframe the conversation globally and recognize some of the differences in practices and expectations and ethics across cultures. So thank you for all that information, and also sharing your personal experience with foster care.
no, thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, Torie, we did have someone sent me a direct message. Let's see, a Zoom user. Please ask if her academic interests, PhD studies, were inherited from her birth family.
What a great question. So I did not start out studying sociocultural anthropology with a lens on the US adoption industry. That came much later in my academic career. I've always had an interest in race and ethnicity and identity development and kind of cross-cultural experiences. But I will say with such joy that when I finally learned of my paternal birth grandmother, so this is my Black father's mother, I found out that she is a historian in Ohio, and she has done significant work researching the story of Columbus's first African-American individual, which happened to be a Black child that was raised in a white family. And I find that mind-blowing because before she ever knew I existed, she was already deep in a story of, I won't call it transracial adoption because I'm very particular about the fact that adoption has changed over time historically, and it was not a legal transaction at that point. It was more of an informal arrangement. But the fact that this is a story that's familiar to her is so amazing to me. So I have always been a poet, and I did in undergraduate work in public history and preserving Black business districts in rural towns. And she is a poet and she works on public history. And I have joined Black historical societies. She runs a Black historical society. So the similarities to me are just like insane. And of course that makes me even more eager to meet her and feel as though the pressure is even higher to hope that she's everything I dream that she might be. So I am totally convinced that these interests have somehow passed through the bloodline, because to me, she's basically what I want to be when I grow up. And I am, the coincidence of the interests is too profound for it to just be a coincidence.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, do we have any last minute questions before we go into closing comments? Anybody have a last minute question for Torie?
I have one question.
Go right ahead, Sophia.
Oh, okay, sorry. I don't know if you can like relate to this or not, but
I think you're muted right now, Sophia. I don't know if that was intentional.
oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
This is so embarrassing. Okay.
No, that's fine. Just start over.
Okay. Okay, so I'm adopted by two white people, right? And they're both divorced now, and they're both like dating, and I don't know how to go about telling my mom, like, because I don't know, like my mom doesn't really talk about race that much, and like she doesn't really care that much about it. And so when she brings her boyfriend around who says insensitive things, I don't know how to explain to her that it was not like okay, you know what I mean? Because like she doesn't care either. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense. And I'm so sorry that you have to deal with that, because you're in a position where the person that you're close to and love isn't able to or willing to kind of advocate for you in that moment.
Yeah, I just don't know what to do, because like when he says something that's like sexist or misogynistic, she gets upset, right? But when he says something that's like anti-Black or homophobic, because I'm queer, she like doesn't care. You know what I'm saying? Like she only like, if it impacts her, that's kind of when she'll say something, or like You know what I'm saying? But when it's
Yeah,
like
no, that makes sense.
anyone else, it's just like, oh, I'm sorry that you feel that way. Because I've tried to explain that before, but she was just like, she just told me that I just have to get used to it. Like, that's kind of like how the real world is. Like, I don't know how to like explain to her like things like that of that nature.
Yeah, that's a really hard position to be in, because it sounds like, you know, there really has to be a willingness on the part of the other person to recognize the fault for there to be any hope of some kind of change, right?
Right.
I mean, my best advice to you, and it is not fun, is to be straightforward and to have an honest conversation. And maybe you've already done this with your mom about, and like starting, I always start with a rose with my mom, which is something positive. Like, there's so many things that you do for me that I really appreciate, and I feel deeply loved by you in so many ways. But there is this one aspect of our relationship that hurts me. And I really want to see the love that I get from you in every other area expressed through something that is personally meaningful to me, which is my racial and sexual identity. Like really putting it in personal terms of like, not just like, I don't like that this person does that, or that's wrong, but this specifically hurts me and damages my relationship with you. Because in my experience, when my parents have done that with me, it impacts my ability to trust them. And it
Right,
impacts my
exactly.
ability to desire a continued relationship with them. And I think that's a really hard thing, because you're an adult, right? You're not a child. So you have a choice
Right.
to remove or distance yourself from relationships that are damaging and hurtful to you. And I've never given my parents an ultimatum. I've not been malicious, but I have let them know that I am an adult, and these are my expectations of you as an adult interacting with an adult. These are the ways that I've been hurt. These are the ways that I would love to see change. I understand that this is hard. This might be confusing. This might be a lot of work. I'm willing to give you grace in that process. But in order for me to continue investing in the relationship and feeling that it's a healthy one, I need to have a commitment from you.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
the kind of conversation I've had to have with my parents. And I will say, Sophia, that it didn't go well.
Okay.
I'm not gonna like
Okay.
give this
Yeah.
false hope that it was immediately like, wow, we're so sorry. You know, it was,
Yeah.
we feel hurt by you. We feel like you are the one that is rejecting us, right? You know, and that is not uncommon, right? That it's probably gonna hurt. There's probably gonna be some defensiveness. But I can say that it has gotten better. Okay. So even though like those first couple conversations were so messy and so tense, and we had to take emotional breaks from each other, there has been positive movement forward. And now that's my situation. That's my story. That might not be the case for you, but I really do think it takes some thinking on your part of like, is this something I can sustain? Is this something that I feel like is impeding my own emotional growth, stability, and health? And if it is, you know, how can I communicate it to those people that I love? And B, what boundaries do I need to put up for myself?
Yeah.
Which is so hard for adoptive people, I think, because I don't want boundaries. I want you attached to me at the hip.
Right.
You're not going
Yes.
anywhere. Like, I don't want to do anything to possibly risk pushing you away, right? So that's why for me, I've always buried the boundaries, because I don't want to risk the only family I know, the only family I have saying no to me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think having other transracial adoptees become my chosen family And going to therapy has really made me understand the importance of those boundaries and the positive and really healthy relationship that can come on the other side of them, both with yourself and with the people that you're putting those boundaries in place with. That was extremely long-winded. I don't know if that was helpful at
No,
all.
I literally love that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I will put, for anyone who has additional questions or would like to connect offline, that's my email. Sophia, you're welcome to as well, but that's there in case you'd like to chat some more.
And they can follow you on IG.
Yes, that is true. You can also follow me at Wreckage and Wonder on Instagram. I'm a little bit less active there because I'm just trying to focus on myself.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Torie. We've really enjoyed having you tonight. I thank everybody. Give Torie a hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's so meaningful to have folks come into this space. I deeply appreciate your attentive listening and just your kind reception of my story.
Thank you. Okay, as we're winding down, Jennifer, what do we have? What do you have for me? Okay, our next guest is next week, next Friday, September the 3rd, we have Barbara Sumner. Barbara is from New Zealand, and she is an author and a documentary filmmaker. And I'm currently reading her book, Tree of Strangers. She's got a great story. She does a lot of work in the adoption community, and we're excited to meet her next Friday. So make sure that you don't miss another episode and come back and see us. And let's see. Oh, we have more. Okay, we've got a reminder about Joyce's support group, Putting Yourself Together After Reunion. Lost and Found, Then What?
And I did drop it in the chat. It's the 23rd is her next one. She's giving us a little space because of conference.
Okay, so that would be September 23rd. Thank you, Jennifer. And that's all for me. That's a wrap. Want everybody to have a great week. Again, if you have any questions about conference, please feel free to reach out to myself, Jennifer, Beth, David, Barbara, anyone on the board. We're happy to answer your questions. This is going to be unique. This is unique for us. This is first of its kind, a hybrid conference with in-person and many watching from home. So we appreciate your support and are looking forward to a great couple of days in Indy. So with that, everybody have a great weekend. We appreciate you. Torie, stay on for just 1 second. Jennifer will go ahead and send you a copy of the chat room so you can go back and read the comments. And
Okay, great. That's awesome.
okay. And again, we just want to personally thank you for coming on. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
I did. It was so wonderful. You guys have such an awesome community here.
It's great. And you know, we'll send you the recording. Please share it on your social media sites as well amongst your followers, and we'll be staying in touch. We would like to see you at conference.